Chapter 15 of The Hunt for the Fallen Star. Ruins. They walked through a cluster of blackened foundations, the remaining testaments of former buildings. Sand, dust, and other debris congregated around the base of crumbling walls and huddled around the corners while shadows lengthened across the desolation. Short green plants huddled near large rocks and wall remnants. They passed through the deteriorated remnants and ascended into the low foothills where small gravel and rocks littered the ground. Casey looked back, and then towards the ruins at the base of the cliff before them. I wonder when this place was destroyed. Without dating it, Heather mused, I'm guessing it's much older than it looks. It seems like a fairly arid place, and if the local sun isn't as intense as ours, then things might not deteriorate as quickly. My guess, said James, is it's probably happened about the same time the Fallen Star left, assuming the ship left from here. They continued a short distance to the base of the cliffs, where jagged edges of an old structure jutted from the rock face. Inside the ruins, a ragged cave mouth opened 50 feet wide, its top reaching the height of a second story. Charred and corroded materials were strewn about. Some items seemed to barely have aged, while others were so decayed they looked like the slightest breeze could break them into dust. A light wind began to blow up the foothills. James looked back at the lowlands, cocked his head, and squinted. If I didn't know where the ship was there, I'd never believe someone if they told me it was. Let's go in, said Heather with a shiver. I'm warmed up from the short hike, but let's check out what's inside. The wind's getting a little cool out here. Sorry, I don't have a jacket, said Casey. I've got a rain poncho if you need it, though. Heather smiled at the offer. I'm good for now, but I may take you up on the poncho for our walk back. They cautiously stepped through the collapsed doorway and walked among the broken walls toward the jagged cave mouth at the back. Several boulders, cleaved from the cliffs overhead, cluttered the dilapidated structure. The cave opening continued back nearly 100 feet, where the darkness consumed the light amid debris piles. Casey and James retrieved their headlamps as the cave walls came together in a narrow neck of night. Pointing to a fractal-like patterns of white, stringy objects on the cave walls, James commented, Looks like some kind of fungus, which is a good sign for moisture. Just don't disturb it, though. At the farthest point back, James's light penetrated a dark opening at ground level. Shining the light through the opening, he knelt on the rocks and studied it. Looks like it might go somewhere. He paused. I think I can fit through it. Heather shook her head. I don't think that's a good idea. James nodded. Probably not. But if there's water here, it's most likely somewhere in there. Just be careful, warned Heather. We're a long ways from help. James got down on his belly and pulled himself into the darkness. Casey knelt on the rock floor and watched snatches of his brother's light through the opening. After a minute, a muffled but animated voice filtered through the crawl space. You guys gotta come through. It opens up back here, like an old hallway. Here, Casey reached into his pack. Take my backup light. Heather put the headlamp on. Then she reached into her pocket and pulled out an elastic hairband. While Casey squirreled through the opening, Heather quickly pulled her hair into a ponytail before following. A wide hallway opened up before the flashlights. Unlike the entry building, very little debris littered the ground, and the walls were more intact. They cautiously walked along the passage for about a minute before arriving at an intersection. James's light probed left, right, and straight. Which way? Let's keep going straight, suggested Casey. Should be easier to find our way back. We can try the other directions another time, but just in case, I'll scratch an arrow pointing on this wall. As they continued down the passageway, their footsteps woke dust from its long slumber, and 3 beams of light filtered through the stirred history. A few seconds later, Heather's hand jumped to her mouth. Her light illuminated the dark skeletal remains of a humanoid. Further along the passage, a series of thick doorways hung precariously from charred hinges. Above them, pieces of wiring and a variety of utility and infrastructure parts dangled from the ceilings, their counterparts haphazardly scattered among the rubble on the floor. A little further along the passage, 2 alcoves were cut into the walls. The first was prior to a series of 4 former doorways, and the second one was between them. Skeletal remains guarded each alcove, collapsed in on themselves from their eternal guardianship. Beyond the doorways, the passage continued onward. A short distance later, a small room opened to the left. Inside, mechanical and electronic-looking devices had clearly been blasted into fragments. The remains of screens, tables, and other items lay scattered around the room. Black scars of melted black rock ripped across the rooms or across the walls in random and fractal patterns. The passage continued, curved left, and ended at another doorway that had also been blown apart. 3 skeletons laid crumpled in heaps near the entrance. Beyond the remains was a large room. Light beams barely illuminated the opposite walls. The dilapidated and destroyed equipment hinted that the room had once been some kind of manufacturing facility or a lab. 3 rows of 4 stone pillars, each pillar standing like an emotionless sentinel, were spaced about 50 feet from each other in the walls. Some workbenches were covered with parts of equipment and machinery that had been tossed or abandoned. Near empty workbenches, old parts and pieces had been thrown across the floor as if someone had stormed the room in a rage. Overturned tables and chairs added to the chaos, and burn marks scarred much of the room and its contents. James's headlamp panned across the room. Wonder what they made in here. James's eyes darted over the old parts and equipment. There might be something useful, he said hopefully, although it looks fairly well ransacked. Still, we should divide up and meet on the other side. It looks like there may be another opening on the far right corner. Casey, cautioned Heather, remember, we're looking for food or water. If we have time later, we can see if any of the gadgets are worth taking. Casey smiled. You know me too well. I'll do my best to resist. Casey walked along the left side, James along the right, and Heather went through the middle. A few minutes later, they met at the opposite side, and the opening at the opening Casey had seen. Inside, a wide hall curved to the right. Walking along the passage, they became aware of a dim phosphorescence leaking into the hallway ahead of them. The hall merged into a massive cavern that was more than twice the size of the manufacturing room. The cavernous room was a rough L shape, with a long part stretching to the right, while a shorter, wider section lay immediately before them. Most of the ceiling and walls were natural, although the floor had been leveled and parts of the cavern had been widened. Among the stalactites that sharply pointed down from the ceiling were streamers of faint luminescence that ran the length of the room and towards a distant glow at the right. Under the dim lighting and flashlight beams, they discovered the room had been no stranger to destruction. Derelict large machinery and mechanical equipment lay in heaps to the left, either destroyed by weapons or torn apart by looters. Casey cocked his head to the right and pointed down the long stretch. Is that outside light I'm seeing? I think so, said Heather. They walked the longer side to where it passed through an open doorway that rivaled an aircraft hangar. Unlike the smaller doorways inside the facility, this one had no forced entry damage. The humongous doors were recessed into the side walls where only small deposits of dust had managed to gather. Beyond the doorway, the cave narrowed to 100 feet. Stalagmites groped upwards from the cave floor, and daggered stalactites bit down from the ceiling. The cave arced upwards and to the right, where dim light filtered in. They traversed the cave floor and through stone spikes that reached up to their counterparts. Before them, the cave's jaws opened into the fresh evening air. Scattered across the rocky ground were dozens of stems that each contained 3 round funnel-shaped leaves that opened towards the sky. White, lily-like flowers topped a few of the stems. Hardier green and orange lichen-like organisms clung to the rocks at the edge. A chilled evening breeze billowed the brothers' clothes while they surveyed the alien moonscape. Heather remained a more respectable distance from the cliff edge. The red planet sat low in the sky. Dark clouds were beginning to mask the stars that had just begun to show themselves in the oncoming twilight. On both sides of the cave opening, the cliff bowed outward and rose up into the mountain range. The last rays of daylight illuminated the peaks on the left. 300 feet below, the shallow foothills stretched out into the desert scape. These became rounded steps, slowly climbing up to the mountainous terrain. On the far left, A strip of green darkened in the fading light. The ruins they had passed through earlier lay before them. Beyond the foothills, the old alien shipwreck lay as a monument to the ancient battle that scarred this area. A little further out, thin wisps of smoke from the newer crash created eerie apparitions in the fading light. Somewhere between the two wrecks, the fallen star expertly blended into the landscape. "Is that where we parked?" asked James, pointing at a dark patch. "I think so, but I'm not sure," replied Casey. "Besides the cloak, I think the ship has some kind of adaptive skin that blends into its surroundings, kind of like a chameleon." "That explained the funky firelight trick back at the pyramid," said Heather. She stepped closer to the edge and tried to keep the wind from whipping strands of her brown hair across her face. "It reminds me of some of the barren places in southern Arizona or New Mexico." She looked down and stepped back nervously. "I didn't think we'd climbed up this high." "Yeah, I think I got a little turned around in there," said Casey. "I was thinking the landscape looks a bit like the Painted Hills in Oregon." "How long since we left the ship?" asked Heather. James glanced at his watch. "Just over an hour. It's getting dark faster than on Earth. With this plant life, there should be water, but with the fading daylight, we may need to head back." Casey turned to walk back when his right foot kicked something that skidded across the ground. His light swept the ground and stopped at a dirt-encrusted L-shaped object near a small boulder. Heather stepped beside Casey. "What is it?" Casey shrugged, bent down, and picked up the object. He brushed off the dirt and dust. The object appeared to be a foot-long handgun with 2 barrels. The grip dropped down about 4 inches, but there was no indication of a trigger mechanism. "It looks like some kind of gun." "Be careful with it," warned James. "It probably doesn't work, but just in case, it wouldn't be the first old thing to surprise us by working." Casey put the object in his pack. "I'll take it back to the ship to get a better look at it." "Figures you'd find something," replied James, shaking his head. They started back to the massive cave when Casey paused. "What now?" asked Heather. Casey cocked his head and closed his eyes. "I thought I heard something." Away from the wind at the cliff edge, the stillness was almost palpable. They waited. After a minute, they heard a faint but definite plop. "That sounds like a drip," exclaimed James. Heather's light skimmed across the rock formations. "Where did it come from?" The 3 lights scoured the room, the dark corners and recesses of the cave. James's light panned across one corner, and the beam reflected higher on the wall for an instant. He redirected the light and walked towards an apparent black hole that reflected the light. He approached the smooth black surface, and a drip from the ceiling disappeared into the mirror-like surface with a soft plop, and a gentle ripple fanned out. James aimed his light into the liquid. Part of the beam reflected higher up the nearby cave wall, and the rest refracting into a shallow depths of a small, rocky pool about 3 feet long and a foot wide. He crouched down, bent his head near the liquid, and cautiously sniffed. Satisfied, he then touched the surface, examined the fluid on his fingers, then brought it closer to his nose. "Looks like fresh water," said James. "Doesn't have a smell, but I think I'd purify it first." "Especially since you touched it," teased Heather. "Hopefully the filters will work on whatever might be lurking in there," added Casey. He took off his pack and pulled out a water bladder. "There's still a bit of earth water left. Probably best to drink it first since we know it's safe." Casey passed the water to Heather. She took several sips through the bite valve before returning the nearly empty bladder. James retrieved his water bladder and finished off the few remaining ounces. The brothers unscrewed the fill caps of the bladders and took turns carefully submerging the openings into the small pool, being careful to keep the drinking ends from becoming contaminated. After packing up the water containers, they retraced their steps back to the main entrance. End of chapter.